The paper had gone soft at the folds. That is the first thing I noticed when my grandson laid it on the kitchen table. It was January, and the windows had gone white at the corners from the cold. A little flour still clung to the wood from the bread I had kneaded that morning. He opened the page carefully, smoothing it with both hands, and I saw my own handwriting from more than 50 years ago. 12 rules for a husband and wife. Rules I had copied when I was 23 years old. Rules I had hidden after my wife died. I knew what he was going to ask before he lifted his eyes. I just did not know whether I had the courage to answer him. My name is Mullen. I have been Amish all my life. I am a farmer, a widower, a father, and now a grandfather to young people who ask questions I was taught not to ask. I tell these stories because age has a way of loosening the knots a man once mistook for truth. Before I am finished, I would like you to think about one thing from your own life. Was there ever a rule you followed for so long that you forgot to ask whether it was right? You can tell me in the comments. And if these quiet memories mean something to you, you are welcome to subscribe and sit with me again. My grandson found that paper in the bottom drawer of an old walnut desk. The desk had belonged to my father. One of the runners had warped, so the drawer never came all the way out unless you lifted it and pulled toward the left. Beneath it was a shallow space, no deeper than 2 fingers. That was where I had put the page, not because it was valuable, not because it was forbidden. I put it there because I did not want anyone to see it, and I did not want to destroy it. There are things a man hides because he is ashamed of what was done to him. There are other things he hides because he is ashamed of what he allowed himself to do. That page belonged to the second kind. The rules were not official in the way an English person might understand official. There was no printed book with a seal on the front. No one signed his name beneath them. In our district, much of what governed a life was spoken. A father told a son, a mother told a daughter, a minister reminded a young couple before marriage. Older people watched, and younger people learned which mistakes brought a visit and which mistakes brought silence. The rules could differ from one settlement to another, even from one family to another, but everybody knew when a line had been crossed. A week before my wedding, my father sat with me in the harness room. I remember the smell of leather oil and the cold coming through the boards near the floor. He spoke for nearly an hour. I wrote down what I could after he left. Some of it was good counsel. A husband was not to mock his wife before the children. A wife was not to shame her husband before neighbors. Neither was to hide debt. Neither was to carry an argument into the meeting house. Work was to be shared. Anger was to cool before words were spoken. Those rules saved us from more than one foolish moment. But other lines sat on the paper beside them. The husband carried the final word in matters of land, money, and discipline. A wife was to bring her disagreement to him privately and accept the decision once it had been made. Trouble inside the marriage was to remain inside the marriage unless the ministry was invited to counsel. Leaving the home after a serious disagreement was treated as rebellion, not protection. Questioning the custom of the district was described as pride. A husband who kept order was considered faithful, even when the order cost his wife her voice. I copied every line in the same careful hand. That is what troubles me now. I did not place a mark beside the gentle rules and another beside the hard ones. At 23, I thought they all came from the same place. I thought obedience made them holy. My wife, Miriam, was 21 when we married. She had strong hands, dark hair, and a way of noticing when a room had become tense before anyone else did. She did not enjoy conflict, but she was not weak. There is a difference. Weakness bends because it has no strength. Miriam often bent because she was measuring the cost to everyone else. During our first year, we did not need the paper. We were too busy learning the ordinary things. How she liked the stove banked at night. How I left wet gloves too close to the door. How much salt belonged in bean soup. How two people could be tired from different work and each believed the other had been spared. We made mistakes, apologized, and went on. Marriage felt less like a rule and more like learning the shape of another person's footsteps in the dark. The trouble came slowly, as most trouble does. In our 7th year, a neighboring farm came up for sale. The soil was dark and heavy, good for corn if the spring stayed dry. I wanted that land with a hunger I called responsibility. We had 3 children by then. I told myself I was building something for them. The price was more than we could safely carry, and Miriam knew it before I did. She kept the household accounts in a small green ledger. Every candle, every sack of flour, every payment for seed was written in her narrow hand. One evening she placed the ledger on the table between us. Rain tapped against the window. The lamp chimney needed cleaning, so the flame gave off a thin ribbon of smoke. She had marked the numbers that frightened her. I looked at them, but I did not really see them. I had already imagined the new field. I had imagined my sons working it. I had imagined older men saying that Malin had expanded what his father began. Miriam wanted us to wait 1 year, that was all. 1 year to clear a debt and see what the next harvest brought. I reached for the rule instead of reaching for wisdom. I reminded her that land and money were mine to decide. I said I had heard her concern and would carry the burden of the choice. Those words sounded responsible to me then. In truth, they allowed me to end the conversation at the exact point where listening became uncomfortable. We bought the farm. That summer was dry. The corn curled by noon. The well dropped low enough that we could hear the bucket strike mud. By autumn, I was selling tools I had inherited from my father. We kept the land, but it took 9 years before the debt stopped sitting at the table with us. 9 years of patched harness, delayed repairs, and Miriam turning dresses so the faded side faced inward. She never said that she had been right. She did not need to. The rule had given me the final word. It had not given me good judgment. That was the first crack, though I did not call it one. I called it hardship. Men are often skilled at renaming the evidence against them. There were other moments, small ones. Those may have done more damage than the large decision because they came so often. Miriam would suggest visiting her sister after a hard week, and I would say the work could not wait. She would question a punishment I had chosen for one of the children, and I would remind her that disagreement should not weaken a father's authority. She would ask whether we could speak to someone outside our district about a problem, and I would say family matters stayed under the roof. Nothing in those moments looked dramatic. No plate broke, no door slammed. The cows still needed milking, and the bread still rose beside the stove. That is why a bad rule can live so long. It does not always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it sits quietly in a man's pocket and gives him permission, one ordinary day at a time. My grandson stood at the kitchen table with the paper between us. He had read every line. His finger rested beside the one about the husband's final word. He was old enough to understand what it meant and young enough to believe that understanding should lead immediately to refusal. He asked me one question, "Grandpa, why did you ever obey this?" I looked through the window toward the maple by the lane. Snow had settled in the place where a branch split during a storm 2 years earlier. I could see the cut I had made with the saw, pale wood against dark bark. A wound does not disappear because it has stopped bleeding. I told him I had obeyed because everyone I trusted had taught me that obedience and goodness were the same thing. That was the simplest answer. It was also incomplete. I obeyed because I loved my parents. I obeyed because my father had lived by those rules and had been called honorable. I obeyed because the men who taught them had worked beside us at barn raisings, sat with the dying, and brought food when a house burned. They were not strangers trying to harm us. They were people woven into every part of our lives. When good people hand you a harmful idea, it can take longer to recognize the harm. I obeyed because belonging was not a small matter. The district was work, worship, family, trade, reputation, and the promise that your children would not stand alone. To question one rule felt like pulling a thread from a coat in winter. A young man could not know whether the whole thing would come apart in his hands, and I obeyed because some of the rules benefited me. That is the answer I least wanted to give my grandson. It would be easy for me to say I was trapped by my time. There is truth in that. A man is shaped by what surrounds him. But I was not a fence post. I had a conscience. I knew the difference between Miriam's quietness when she was content and her quietness when she had been overruled. I saw the difference in the way she folded a cloth, the way she pressed her lips together before speaking, the way she moved more slowly after a conversation I had ended too soon. I noticed. I simply had rules that allowed me not to act on what I noticed. Years passed. The children grew. The debt shrank. Miriam and I became gentler with each other, though not because anyone handed us a new page. We learned by wear. We learned which words left marks. We learned that winning an argument could make the whole house poorer. We learned that a decision carried by 2 people was lighter than a decision imposed by one. By our 25th year, I rarely used the phrase final word. I did not announce that I had changed. Men of my generation were not practiced at announcing inner changes. I simply began taking the ledger seriously. I began asking Miriam what I was missing. When we disagreed about the children, I waited until I could hear her without preparing my reply. When she believed a family matter needed help beyond our walls, I stopped treating privacy as a higher virtue than honesty. The marriage became stronger when the rules became weaker. I wish I could tell you I understood this all at once and apologize with perfect words. I did not. Regret is often clearer than repair. Repair happens while a man is still confused, still proud, still learning how to say that the thing he called duty may have been fear. Near the end of Miriam's life, I found the paper while cleaning the desk. The ink had faded to brown. I read it beside her empty chair. By then I could see that the list contained 3 different things mixed together. There was wisdom, there was custom, and there was control. Because they had been placed on one page, I had treated them as one truth. I wanted to burn it. I carried it to the stove. The fire had settled into red coals, and I held one corner above the open door, but I could not let go. Burning the paper would not change the years. It might only help me pretend I had become wiser without remembering the cost of how I learned. So I folded it and hid it beneath the drawer. That was not courage. It was a halfway act. I preserved the evidence, but I kept it from judgment. I told myself the paper was private. What I meant was that I did not want my children or grandchildren to see the distance between the man they respected and the husband I had once been. My grandson, finding it, closed that distance in a single afternoon. He did not shout at me. That would have been easier. Anger can give an old man something to push against. He just waited. Young people sometimes think waiting is weakness, but his waiting was stronger than many sermons I have heard. It left the truth in the room with nowhere to go. I told him that there are 2 kinds of obedience. One is chosen after a man has examined his conscience. It can be humble. It can hold a family together when pride wants to tear it apart. The other kind is borrowed. A person follows because everyone before him followed, because disapproval feels unbearable, or because the rule gives him an advantage he does not wish to name. Borrowed obedience can look peaceful from the road. Inside the house, someone may be disappearing. My grandson asked whether I thought the rules were wrong. I told him that question was too small. Some were right. Some were useful for a season. Some were wrong from the beginning. The greater wrong was teaching young people that all rules should be received with the same silence. Wisdom requires sorting. Faith requires conscience. Love requires listening, especially when listening may cost you authority. I also told him not to imagine that his generation had escaped this problem. The paper may look different now. The rules may come through a screen instead of a bishop or a father. They may be called tradition, independence, masculinity, self-respect, success, or boundaries. But any rule can become dangerous when it allows a person to stop seeing the human being in front of him. He folded the page again along the old creases. I could tell he wanted to know what I planned to do with it. This time I did not put it back beneath the drawer. I placed it inside the family Bible, beside the page where Miriam's death was recorded. Not because the rules belonged to Scripture. They did not. I placed them there because our family history contains both the things we are proud to hand down and the things we hope our grandchildren will refuse. A family should not pass on only its virtues. That teaches the young to admire us. It should also pass on its errors. That may teach them to become wiser than we were. There is one sentence I wish I had understood when I was 23. Peace is not the same as silence. A quiet house may be a loving house, or it may be a house where one person has learned that speaking changes nothing. A husband is not faithful because he always has the final word. Sometimes his most faithful act is to surrender it. I obeyed those rules because I was afraid of becoming a bad man in the eyes of people I respected. In doing so, there were times I became less good to the woman whose judgment should have mattered most. That is a hard sentence for an old man to say, but it is true. I cannot return to the kitchen with the smoky lamp and choose differently about the land. I cannot give Miriam back the years in which my certainty weighed more than her wisdom. What I can do is tell my grandson the whole truth. I can tell him that tradition should be carried with open hands, not clenched fists. I can tell him to keep what is loving, question what is convenient, and refuse any rule that requires another person's smallness in order to preserve his own place. 70 years have taught me that a rule may guide a marriage, but it cannot love for you. It cannot listen for you. It cannot apologize. Those things must still be done by two imperfect people, day after day, while there is still time. If this memory brought someone to your mind, tell me what rule your family carried and whether you kept it, changed it, or finally laid it down. I read those comments more carefully than you may think. And if you would like to hear more stories from a long Amish life, you are welcome to subscribe. I will be here, and I will tell you what I can while I still have the voice to tell it.